Hello, welcome everyone in huge numbers. Today we have the pleasure of seeing a presentation of Judith Verstegen, who is a geoinformation scientist from the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning here at Utrecht University. And she's interested in human-environment interactions and simulation modeling. And today she's going to talk about agent-based modeling of pedestrians. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Tabea. Welcome, everyone. My voice is a bit bad because I was ill over the weekend, so I hope you can hear me. If you cannot hear me, let me know. So I structured my talk in the following way. First, I will quickly introduce the idea of human environment systems, the type of systems that we study in the human geography department. And I'll provide a few definitions, and then I'll come to two geosimulation case studies, both about pedestrians. One about route choice strategies, looking at pedestrians from origin to destination. And then one modeling exercise that builds upon that, where we looked at physical distancing during the corona pandemic. So what you see here is an overview picture that I always show in all my talks, so some of you may know it. So what we see here is a couple of global challenges that we have in the world. For example, when we increase irrigation, we may end up with water shortages, or when agricultural land expands, we may cause habitat fragmentation, or in cities, air pollution may cause respiratory diseases. And to you, these problems may all seem very different, but what they basically have in common is that there is a certain system where humans interact with their environment. And because the humans have certain behavior, that has an impact on the environmental system. And of course, we're interested in solving these global challenges. So basically to look for interventions that can help prevent these negative impacts. And what we do with simulation models is to look at the impacts of different interventions. So basically to test out different interventions in an experimental setting so that we can see which one works the best. And we better do that in a computational model rather than in the real world, because in the real world, we first of all may have to wait a very long time before we see the impact of the intervention. Secondly, if it doesn't work out, there's no way to go back. And also the costs of these interventions may be very high, and that's a pity if they don't work. So that's why we use simulation models, first of all, to basically test our theories about how the system works in the first place, and secondly, what will happen if. That brings me to a point that I just want to shortly mention, which is something that Simon and I are working on. That is important to distinguish between the different purposes of models, and that the type of models that we're talking about here, we use them to do projections, and that's a different thing from predictions. Prediction is a probabilistic claim about the state in the future, so that you think that something will happen based on the knowledge of the current state, whereas a projection is an if-then conditional probability. So to assess the effects of interventions, and basically this exact intervention in that way is never going to take place. So you're not predicting that will happen like you predict the weather. It's important to distinguish between these two, also in the communication to the audience about the results of such models. But that's basically a side note. So I talk about geosimulation models all the time. I'm from the geography faculty, so I think it may be good to introduce to you what I mean with that. We can look at a geosimulation model conceptually based on this figure over here. A simulation model has F which is the transition function that captures all the dynamics that we observe in the system. That transition function may consist of a number of rules. So they're usually rule-based models. These rules, they contain parameters. These parameters will become important later because these are the parts that we need to calibrate for this model. The model takes certain inputs or drivers that change over time. This can be temperature, for example, in a climate model. But in a pedestrian model, it can also be the number of people that enter into your city. Then, based on these rules, we can compute the system state at time t, and that's something at the aggregate level of your system. So these can be the flows of pedestrians, the densities that you have per street. And based on that, you can compute the impacts that I was talking about on the first slide. So what we basically do with geosimulation is that we test for different scenarios. It can be scenario A, a business as usual, and a scenario B with some intervention applied. And then we assess, okay, scenario B may cost more, but our environmental impacts will be lower. So we can plot it in this kind of decision space. Then you may wonder if what I'm doing is machine learning. It's not. So you can have a whole range of models that you call spatial temporal models. That means that they simulate the state of a spatial system over time. On the one end of the spectrum, on the right, we have process-driven models that start with a theory. So this theory is what we implement in a rule-driven model. And therefore, what we have in a model is based on known or assumed cause-effect relations between drivers and the system state. So what I do falls into that category. Then machine learning is what we see on the left-hand side, where we start with a bunch of data and we fit a model to that. Then what you have there, the rules, they are based on correlations between the drivers and the system state. Of course, the whole thing is never so black and white as you see it here, because most models fall somewhere in the middle, because our theory is usually not complete. So there are always some components that you have to determine empirically, especially when you deal with humans in your system and not just physical processes. So here you see an example of a geosimulation model. Just as an example, this is the output of an urban growth model for Madrid, where we see in black probability of 1 that it's urban, and in white a probability of 0 that it's urban. And over time, some areas are likely to become urban. And it's spatial because what we see here is a map that represents the physical state of the world. I know that some of you here are physicists and mathematicians, so I want to elaborate a little bit on what the challenges are for modeling human environment systems. So in physics, it may be relatively easy to have a theory that you can implement in a model, but in the social sciences, theories are more scattered. There are smaller domains that may not communicate with each other. So we have, for example, environmental psychologists with their theories about how people perceive the world. Also, we have the human geographers, which have a bit broader perspective, and so on. So there are many scattered fields from which you may find theories that you can implement in models. However, these theories are also usually qualitatively described rather than quantitatively. So we as modelers then first also have to make a translation from words into equations that we can implement. Also, humans can take decisions, that's a problem. So physical particles don't take decisions, but human takes decisions, and those decisions aren't always rational. Also, they take decisions based on their perception of reality, which is not the same as reality itself. So there's something in between, something that we call a cognitive map as geographers. So So people make a map of the environment that is a simplification of what the real world looks like. Humans are heterogeneous, not only in their attributes, in the sense that someone is older or younger than me, but also in their behavior, so they don't always follow the same rules. And also data about individuals is sparse and sensitive in the sense of privacy, so it's not, even when it's available, it's not always easy to get or to use or to publish when you work with those data. Part of this talk will be about calibration. So calibration in a more traditional sense of the word, like we know it from the physical sciences, is that when you have this model that I was just talking about and you have your modeled system state, what you tend to do is look for observations in the real world that are exactly what you are modeling, or maybe some derived metric. So like when you have a hydrological model, you may not have how much water there is everywhere in your river, but you may have a discharge curve at some point. So you may have to translate what you modeled into what you can observe, and then you can compare them. And what you tend to do is then change the parameters in your model in such a way that this is the best match. However, what we can also do is try to find values or distributions for these parameters in different ways when we cannot compare the modeled system state to the real world. This is often the case for agent-based models, that we cannot. To give you an example, if I model pedestrians in a certain city, I could observe, for example, the number of pedestrians in a certain street in that same city. However, the problem is that I don't know the boundary conditions of the real world. I don't know how many pedestrians there are in total in that city at the moment. So I can never reproduce these boundary conditions in my model. Therefore, this comparison doesn't necessarily make sense. So we have to find a different way to calibrate our models. So when I talk about geosimulation, we basically have two modeling paradigms, agent-based and field-based, that is in line with what we use in terms of data, vector and raster-based data in geography. So in agent-based modeling, the system state consists of a set of discrete objects, namely our agents, and all attributes that we model are linked to those agents. The processes that we model are the behaviors of these agents, and the agents usually move through space. That's when it becomes more interesting. In field-based modeling, our system state can be discrete, but can also be continuous, like elevation. Attributes have a value everywhere in space, so not just at the place where we have agents. And what we model is the behavior of cells that remain in their location. That makes it a completely different modeling paradigm. So if we want to model something moving, like water flowing, we have to update the states of the cells instead of actually moving an object. And this talk is about agent-based modeling, although we can also do human environment systems with field-based modeling, for example, the urban growth model that you already saw. Route choice strategies. So what I have to clarify here is the spatial scale that I tend to use in my models. So I model here in both examples that I will give, pedestrians at the scale of a whole city, and I'm interested in how they pick their routes, and specifically for pedestrians that are familiar with the city and that don't use a navigation device. Otherwise, it's quite easy to know what route they pick because I can use Google Maps and compute what they do. What I don't look at is where the pedestrian is exactly within that street or on a square, which makes it different from other models where you have a smaller spatial scale. So I'm interested in how they pick their route from A to B. I had a PhD student a couple of years ago, and he was interested in making pedestrian simulation models more connected to theory in spatial cognition. The problem was that most pedestrian simulation models, they were made by people not from that domain, and they just assumed that agents would take the shortest path from A to B. That's it. But that's not how it works in reality, because, as I said before, people have a cognitive map in their mind, and they use that cognitive map to navigate, and the map is not complete, and the decisions are not rational. So what we use here is the theory of Lynch. Lynch is an American scholar from the 60s, and he wrote this book, The Image of the City. There he has the theory that people use 5 urban elements to make their cognitive map of the city. These elements are landmarks. Landmarks are things, for example, buildings or statues that are easily recognizable in the city. Districts. Districts are regions that have some coherence in them. For example, the city center as opposed to a certain residential area from a certain age, and a residential area that's newer, where all the houses look different. Nodes. Nodes are important crossings basically in the city for traffic. And then we have edges. Edges are parts that are not easy to cross, for example, railway lines, and paths. And so we thought that agents should have a cognitive map that corresponds with this theory from Lynch. What we then first did is try to computationally extract those urban elements from spatial data, because that hadn't been done before. So we thought, okay, let's look at spatial data sets that are available of roads, buildings, and let's see if we can reproduce what Lynch found. And so first paper was about this map from Lynch, from Boston, and what we extracted based on spatial data. And there are some similarities there, but it's not relevant so much for this talk, or not the focus. So then we took this to a pedestrian simulation model. As said, current pedestrian agent-based models that use least cost paths. That's either the shortest path or least angular change. So that's another idea of a shortest path, namely a path where you don't have to take too many corners, because that tends to confuse people. So you want to choose a path where you have to have as little turns as possible. So these 2 types of models existed, and what we then did is make a third version where the pedestrians, the agents, use the 5 elements of Lynch to construct their route from A to B. We run this model for several case studies, London, Paris, Boston, but what I want to present here is where we run the final model for the small city of Münster, where I was at that time working, and also where my PhD student was based, because there we try to calibrate the model. So what we did is we tried to find values for the parameters that the pedestrians have in this model, and I'm not going to give you all the equations of the model because I don't think that's relevant, but you have to imagine that these parameters, for example, mean what the weight is of landmarks versus regions versus the least cost path minimization that they use in constructing their route. And what we did is we designed an online questionnaire that we sent out in Münster. We had 418 participants in that questionnaire, and we did some filtering so people could get 10 euros for participating in the questionnaire, and then you always have some people that just give answers to get the 10 euros. So we put a time limit that if they took less than, I think, 15 minutes, that we disregarded them because it couldn't be a serious answer. Then we were left with 301, which is a relatively large sample in social sciences. In that questionnaire, we told the participants that it was their goal to reach a destination, and for 3 routes of about 1500 meters if you took the shortest path. Then what's new there, what we did, is because we built the model first, we generated routes with the model with certain parameter settings. So for example, what if it was fully based on shortest path? What would be the route that you take? Or what if we also use landmarks for 50%? And because of that, we could map the answers that the participants gave exactly to particular parameter settings in the model, which is different from what is done normally, because normally you do the online survey first, and then you have to find out how you may want to build an agent-based model from that, which is not always obvious. We partly did this with maps in the questionnaire. So we presented a map to the participant with 3 routes on it from A to B, and they had to say which route they would be most likely to take. And we did it partly as a navigation task with videos. That's what you see here. So we had an origin and a destination, and we let the model compute routes based on certain parameter settings. And we identified decision points, so where it would be possible to change from one route to another. Then of all these, we recorded videos in the rain in Münster. It was a very long and not so nice task. And so what the participants had to do is they were given a video that was running, and then whenever they reached such a decision point, the video was paused, and they had to choose whether they wanted to go left or straight or right. And then based on that, another video was selected that was played for them. And so we could identify how they navigated, so what kind of criteria they took into account. Of course, this was constrained by the model that we had assumed. That's maybe a disadvantage there. So of all the 301 participants, of all the maps and route sections that they took, this was the results. So for example, you can see here that some people used only global minimization heuristics for this part of their route, and then for another part they used urban elements, and here the yellow ones specify which urban elements they used and with what kind of importance relative to each other. So one thing we can do, and one thing we also did, is to use this as our parameters in the model, so that each agent is given a random draw from the distribution that we see here. But another thing we can do and did is to find clusters within this data set. So is it the case that an agent who uses an angular change, so least turns minimization heuristic, does it, for example, often use barriers as well or not? So to find basically correlations between these parameters by doing a clustering analysis and putting them into groups. We used the k-means clustering of the parameters and found that the best separation occurred when we had 6 clusters, and so we can see this as 6 types of agents in our population. And in the paper we also have a kind of description of what this person is, not in the sense of what their profession is or so, but how they navigate, and we link that to literature, which is kind of interesting. So another experiment we did with the model is to have these 6 groups of agents and let the groups draw parameter values from the distributions within these groups. So we can also look at how the groups navigate differently on a map. So here you see Münster, and what you see in the colors is the density. So the white regions are more dense. So you see that certain clusters make more use of this promenade, the ring around the city, whereas others do that less and walk more within the city center. They cross the city center instead of going around it. Then we compared the two. So one, the homogeneous, where we took from the whole parameter distribution, and one, the heterogeneous. And we both compared them with the null model with uninformed parameters. So the first thing to notice is that at least the calibration made a difference, right? So the distributions that we get, they make a quite distinct pattern from the null model. That's, you see blue and red here, otherwise it would be just a black map. But that the difference between the two is not so large. So it doesn't, at the aggregated level, it doesn't matter so much whether you have one group of people taking from the full parameter distributions or these 6 clusters, which can also make sense. Because at this level it averages out. Huh? Yeah. Okay, then I go to the second case study that I want to present here, which is about physical distancing behavior. This was from a grant that I received during the Corona pandemic from the Volkswagen Stiftung in Germany. So the idea started because this was the situation in Utrecht at the time. And for those of you who were living there, maybe you remember what they did in the pedestrian area in the city center. They put these signs on the pavement to make sure that people keep right in order to have 2 streams of people instead of everybody mixed, to try to make them keep distance. This was happening in more cities. But what was quite unique to Utrecht is that they also made one-way streets for pedestrians for the same reason, to try to regulate the flow, that not in one street everybody mixes, but that in one street people all move this way, and in the parallel street they move the other way. And in that way it would be easier to keep distance in theory. We even had a pedestrian roundabout near the HEMA. But what you can already see here we see a person with a bike coming this way. Huh? That means not everybody is complying with these rules. And so that's what you basically would want to evaluate before you implement such interventions. Is it something that actually helps? Will people take these signs into account when they walk there? Because otherwise it's just a waste of money. So our aim with this project was to evaluate the effect of the streetscape and potential interventions in it on the physical distancing behavior. And why this is written here, the streetscape, is that most existing studies up to now about compliance with interventions or such policy interventions in during pandemics, they were interviews where they asked people what they would do. Yeah? What would you do? And this kind of self-reporting about what you would do is known to, unfortunately, not be very truthful, because when people are placed in a scene, they may take other decisions than what they say they will do. And the decisions they take when they are in the scene are not only influenced by their motivations, because the motivation is what you basically test with such a questionnaire, but also with the environment, in the sense of what do other people do around me, but also do I actually observe this this sign over here? Because as a pedestrian, are you used to look at traffic signs? No, right? Because you think that they are not for you. Traffic signs are for cars, and so you don't maybe not even pay attention to them. So that's what we wanted to test here. And we thought, okay, let's take a similar idea of the videos, but then we needed to adapt it a little bit, because the thing is, with the videos, you record reality. But what we wanted to test here were interventions that were not there, so that we cannot film because it's not there. So what we used is an immersive video environment where we could overlay things that we designed, as I will show you here. So what you see here, oh, I cannot use the pointer, here is a sign that's not there. So we created these images and we placed them on top of the videos. And then we let this participant decide for videos with and without these images overlaid. In particular, we gave the participant 3 scenarios. One where there was no pandemic, business as usual. One where there was a pandemic, but with just the current regulations of the government in place. And one where we said, okay, now the government has taken additional measures for pedestrians. We didn't explicitly mention the signs because we were also interested in whether they would observe them in the first place, and some participants did not. And so we used these overlays, tried to make that looking as realistic as possible. And then people, again, had to choose where they wanted to go. And we also used overlays to say how long it would take to reach the final destination if you would take that direction. So people could also assess whether they were basically willing to take a detour in order to comply with the signs over there. Yeah, and we did that in the lab. That's also to have a more immersive experience, that it would look more realistic than just a video on your screen. And we also took safety measures because this was done during the pandemic. So we wore masks, the participants wore masks. They were given a free corona test beforehand. We all tested every day beforehand, all these kind of things. So here you see some results of the user study. This is a very complicated map that basically shows how many people of a certain scenario moved between different decision points. It's a bit hard to interpret, but if you look closely, you do see that when there is a no-go, so a one-way street for pedestrian, that in the third scenario with these signs, the route is taken less often. But more importantly, is this figure over here, where we see the trespassing count. That's how often a street was used. And we see that there is no difference between scenario 1 and 2, no significant difference. Scenario 1 is no pandemic, scenario 2 is a pandemic. So apparently people don't avoid certain streets when there is a pandemic in order to keep distance. But it did go down, the trespassing count for one-way streets, when the signs were placed, so there was an effect of the signs observed. And we also see that in the detour, so that's how much longer a route is compared to the shortest path. There was a slight difference between scenario 1 and 2. In 1, with no pandemic, they usually took the shortest path, so no difference from that. In 2, the mean is slightly higher, so some people diverted, but the difference is not significant. And then in scenario 3, the difference is significant, so they take about 40% longer routes, probably in order to comply with these signs. Then we used that information to build an agent-based model, where the agent walks along the route, and then at each intersection they can change the route that they have in mind. For example, when they encounter such a street sign. How did we calibrate that? We used the data from the user study, and that's a small user study, as you see here. So it's only 26 participants, because this is of course way more labor intensive to bring all participants to the lab. And then we used bootstrapping in order to account for that small user sample. And so we didn't get a single regression out of that, but a lot of regressions, and that gave us a distribution that you see here for all the parameters in the regression model. So for the constant in the regression, and then these two parameters that determine how likely people are to comply with street signs. So, and we use then this distribution for our agent population, again, sampling from that. We also did a sensitivity, global sensitivity analysis, but I think I will skip that for time. So here's what the model looks like. We have our agent roaming around in the city. And then there are certain interventions where we have one-way streets. And you see that some of the agents, they don't comply and they turn red. Some agents do comply, so they're going to take a detour over here. They actually want to go there, but they take a detour.
What's this, the yellow?
So they are just so that you can easily follow them. So here we had two agents that both wanted to go there, and then one is complying by taking a detour and the other one is not. But they're just yellow so that you can easily follow them.
If certain streets are very crowded, don't you get a kind of self-enforcing impact? Because if it's effectively a one-way street, people don't tend to go beyond really kind of wall of people walking the other direction.
Maybe the next slides will answer that question. If it doesn't, I will come back to you at the end, okay? So we did one run of the ABM without interventions. And based on that run, we decided what the most crowded streets were. We found out what the most crowded streets were. They are these streets over here and this kind of roundabout in the middle. And then based on that, we made an intervention design. So we decided which streets would be one way in order to try to reduce the density over there. And we have three scenarios for that. A scenario with 4 interventions, with 8 interventions, and with 10 interventions, and you see them, they're colored. So here's an example of the results for the scenario with 8 interventions and 4,000 agents in the city, where here's the color is the difference in density, number of people, between no interventions and interventions. And what you see is indeed the density in these streets that were made one-way streets goes down. And then of some other streets, of course, the density goes up because these people have to go somewhere. But that increase is not that extreme as the decrease over here. So we don't see very dark green streets. So in that sense, it seems to work that the agents are more distributed over the city because of the interventions. And here you see something that's also interesting, at least from a researcher perspective, is the difference between the model that we calibrated, where the compliance is some number between 0 and 1, so they often comply, but not always, and assuming full compliance, because that would of course be way easier to make a model where you assume that everybody just complies with these measures. And the differences between the two are actually not that big. So this may indicate that the calibration wasn't necessary, but for our case study of Germans, yeah. So it may also be that if you do this for a different city, if you do it for Utrecht, may actually be a bigger difference because the people are less compliant with such measures. Yeah. So this kind of calibration, you have to do it always for your case study because there are differences between cultures, between age groups, between times. Yeah. Then this is the slide that may answer your question, I'm not sure. So here you see a lot of violin plots, they look very similar, but what is meant to be displayed here is the effects of number of agents, 2,000, 4,000, 10,000, and the number of interventions here on the x-axis on the pedestrian densities in the streets. So all points are a street and a point in time. And this red line is the density above which it's no longer possible to keep a 1 meter distance from each other. So everything above that red line is basically bad in terms of transmission of disease. And I think the first thing to notice is that the number of agents in the city has a way larger effect on this density than the interventions, which is of course makes sense. If you have 10,000 people in your city, they have to be somewhere. Then when we have a low number of agents, 2000, our interventions don't really help above this line. It does a bit for the very extreme densities. So with 10 interventions, we do have a lower maximum density in the city, but in general, it's not that bad. So here it does change the shape of what you see in the violin above the line. So I would see with this medium number of agents, the interventions have the most effect. And here with a very high number of agents, you could even say that it has an adverse effect. So with 10 interventions, streets are more crowded. Why is that? Well, that's basically because people have to take long detours. So they are around much longer. Yeah, now that's what I wanted to talk about today. In summary, I talked about geosimulation models that mimic the behavior of a system. They're used to explore future scenarios, in particular the effect of interventions, and therefore they project and not predict. In this talk, I tried to show general methods to collect data for the calibration of agent-based models of human-environment interactions, where we have a direct connection between the model rules and the case study. And also, we can reproduce the exact same narrative for each participant in the user study, which is different from when you place the participants in reality. So when you do a study in reality, each participant has slightly different circumstances because there may be more or fewer people when they are there. It may rain or it may be dry. So this setting is more comparable. And it's safe, which was important in the second case study. And we made a method to add layers in order to create scenarios for these interventions to find behavior for different intervention settings. Thanks for your attention. Now I cannot answer this question. Any questions? Stijn.
I can maybe look on the question from before.
Yeah.
I think because the slide you showed shows the more the impact of higher density or the combination of higher density and measures, but also in the way that the individual agents were modeled, does it also take into account the amount or the busyness of the area? Because I can imagine that in like when the people are actually in that setting with the screens, they may take into account also how busy the street is in the image.
Yeah.
Or in the video.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's one of the limitations that we are addressing at the moment. So when we filmed in that city, we actually wanted to film twice, one with busy streets and once with quiet streets, in order so that we could also use that as a parameter to test for whether people would change their behavior. But there were very few people on that day, so we couldn't film busy streets because there were no busy streets. So what we did later is we also developed overlays to make more people in the streets, but that's of course more complicated than the science because people move and you have to take into account that they go behind objects or in front of it. And so we have a separate paper about that, and it's more in the exploratory stage, I would say. But yeah, that's a very important point, that also the violin plots that I showed there, they may not be realistic because in our case, the agents only respond to the signs and to the other things that we could measure, but not to the busyness of the streets themselves. And there may actually be two opposite effects there. It may be that when it's very busy, people think, okay, but then I shouldn't use this street and take a detour. But also when other people are not complying, people tend to not comply themselves, so may also actually get worse. Yeah. but I don't know what it will be. And also, it will depend on culture and age group and this kind of things as well. Yeah.
When speaking about the difference between what people say they will do and what they actually do,
Yeah.
I was wondering if in this first questionnaire you saw a difference in the route that they drew on the map and the route that they had with the videos. Or if you can compare this.
Yeah, that particular thing we didn't test, but in both questionnaires, we also had questions like, okay, what do you take into account when you pick a route? And in the second case, also, what is the detour that you would be willing to accept in order to comply with measures? And that matched. So the urban elements that they said they used, that also came out of the routes that they picked. And when they said they would be willing to accept a large detour, they also took larger detours. But the specific question about the difference between the maps and the video task, we didn't check.
Yeah, cool.
Tabea.
Thanks, super interesting. I have a question on the previous study of the route choice model. Super interesting that you have this different clusters of like route choice behavior types,
Yeah,
but also that it didn't result in a better like distribution or any model improvement. And I'm wondering, because I'm also modeling traffic behavior, I actually only have like the traffic volume maps per hour for cars. But what I observed with these maps is that really the spatial distribution strongly differs per hour, because in the morning people are busy and they come from outside to inside the city to go to work, and so then like the urban highways are more busy, while in the afternoon, you know, like you have people going outside again, and then there's only activity inside the center of the city for the people that actually live in the city. And it might be that with pedestrian behavior that's not the case, but I was wondering if you had like if you considered, for example, people's purposes of trip, or like the time pressure or something like that, or if that would make sense to include, because then you maybe on this hourly segregation there is a difference that is relevant and that you could observe, but I don't know if that's relevant for the pedestrian.
Yeah, there are two things that I would like to mention there. So first of all, we weren't too surprised to find that, because there are literature studies about other agent-based models that did the same. They compared the result of clusters with homogeneous, and they also didn't find difference. For example, there are papers by Brown about this housing choice of agents. So about how they pick the location that they want to live, that they had a similar result. But another thing that's important here is that there's not so much feedback in this model, because the agents, they don't look at each other. And I think when you include that, it does become important, the clusters, because then you get a path dependence, that more agents follow another agent that does a certain thing. So then it matters more what a single agent does. So that may be a thing to test.
Yeah, maybe also it matters if you're trying to analyze differences between groups of people, because you showed those maps where it indeed look different per.
Yeah, they do look different, but the thing is that when you then overlay all of them again, and you compare that with a group that does on average what they do between these groups, then the maps are the same again. So there are differences between groups, but then overall, if you have agents from different groups or agents homogeneous, then they don't differ. Don't be afraid.
So basically, you in these two case studies, you presented a method or an approach to calibrate these rules, right? That you want, these transition functions, based on letting people experience
what my agents experience too. Yeah.
Now, I was wondering, because the spatial cognition literature is full of debates about what is relevant and what is a landmark and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I guess there's probably thousands of ways how you could actually extract a landmark from such a video, right? So for all of these cases you could, in principle, you could basically calibrate or you can actually try to actually derive rules for all of these things. And I was wondering, is there any way how we can constrain that space, right? Because it's very big. So the potential things that you could react
Yeah.
when looking at a scene, right, are just probably infinite. I'm not sure, they're not
Yeah.
infinite, but very large, right? So how do we actually handle that?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I don't have a very good answer to that, obviously, but so what we try to do here, as I said, is first build the model, and the model doesn't use the videos. The videos were for the interview, but the model uses spatial data to extract landmarks. And what we did in our very first paper is to see if the landmarks we extract from spatial data match with what Lynch said people would use as landmarks. And that matched, so that's the best argument I can give you. We could definitely do that in different ways and also use that to calibrate the model, so to have different sets of landmarks to see which ones would result in a best fit with what people do. But yeah, that wasn't really the focus here.
Yeah, and I have a question about the level of abstraction you used in your model. So you can model a space with a graph-based structure, so
Yeah.
one-dimensional curves.
Yeah.
With decision points and
Mhm.
nodes. Or you can have like a spatial structure, like a navigation mesh or something like that covers the areas where you could walk.
Yeah.
And then there can be a difference between where you really can walk, like pavements versus streets, and sometimes streets are open, sometimes they aren't. So at what level did you do that?
Yeah.
Because it makes I think a big difference what type of paradigm you use, and also what kind of physical phenomena you can capture, like crowd waves, when you have higher crowd densities like 2 or 4 or 5 or even 8
Yeah.
persons per square meter, like we saw in the log parade. Then you have completely different results,
Exactly.
also in choices. And so how do you deal with
Yeah.
these things?
So we use a graph approach, dual graph approach, because we have one-way streets. And before we created the dual graph, we first have the spatial data, and we compute based on this first approach to extract the elements from Lynch. We compute what kind of, so the elements that are there, and we map that to the road segment in the graph. So these spatial characteristics, they are attributes of the edges in the graph.
Okay, and so how do you then compute the road capacity, and more specifically the capacity of, for instance, pavements where you really can walk?
Yeah, so as I tried to say at the beginning, that's not the level at which we model. So we model at the level of the whole street, and I don't know if my pedestrian is on the pavement or on the road or on the left or the right pavement. So what we see here are all averages. We know the length and the width of the street, and we know how many people are there. So it's an average density based on these two. And the actual density can be at different places of that street. It can be more dense and less dense. So it's not necessarily the case if there are only 2 people there that they never are within a meter distance from each other. They can be, but with the abstraction level that I have here, I cannot give that information.
Okay.
It would be a totally different model if I also want to know how agents move within a street or on a square.
Different rule.
Very different rules, yeah. And that is because I'm interested in how agents pick their routes from A to B. So it's a route choice model. It's not walking at the meter level detail.
Yeah.
Have there also been other experiments with giving the agents positive positive reasons to take a D route? For instance, have a rain cover on the road. So kind of little architectural changes on the route to like in city, in places where there's a lot of rain. So than taking a detour, but if then you have
Yeah.
more cover to rain, can be a reason to then take the detour.
Yeah, we didn't test that as interventions. We did research about what other motivations are of people to take a detour, because as I said at the beginning, people don't take the shortest path normally when they know the city and they pick a route by themselves. They tend to go by beautiful places, like they go along parks instead of through busy streets, or they go along shops instead of through residential areas.
Yeah.
So we do have that information in what could make them pick a different route, but we didn't use it in the intervention design.
And sometimes also this combination, because beautiful routes or like parks, but also monuments, also provide more cover to rain or windy environment.
Yeah,
Yeah. And with regard to the traffic signs, has been done research on that, like the traffic signs were not like, they did not take into account the effect of fear of people. So perhaps if there would be like a deadhead sign, that people perhaps would,
Yeah.
well, I know to take that road.
I'm not sure if that's ethical. Try to scare your participants. Yeah, no, we basically took the traffic signs that they used in Utrecht and we redesigned them in German, but made them look similar. Because we wanted to test what the government had already decided to use.
It's an interesting question, because close to my street, there are now signs with, if you bike here, there are consequences, or think about the pedestrians that walk here, please don't bike, so.
Oh,
I guess, might be interesting to see that, if that has any effect,
yeah.
It was to kind of take a few of the ideas here, maybe put some ideas forward as well. It's in on the first study why people make decisions are based on beauty, but then also let's say the busyness of a street. So could it be also you're forcing people away from a one-way street by physical design for a way somebody enters the street, given that there's a huge flow from one direction, having a triangular shaped mechanism, so it enforces people that if there's a lot of flow outwards, they have to choose an alternative route. You know what I mean? So enforcing some limit, some constraints, so they're met with a huge flow of people. So just kind of enforcing a busier
You
street.
mean virtually in the lab or?
As in, you
Yeah,
try to
reality.
enforce a one-way street, the objective is what happens when we put a sign on a one-way street, do
Yeah.
people read the sign? As you say, you could put eyes on that sign, and that's one way to show that if there's eyes looking at you, people are more likely to read the sign. Another one would be, going to his point, a police officer. So if you have the handhaving and the sign, people are again more likely to obey. So again, there's any variation of intervention, eyes, a pirate sign, a police officer, and then a police officer plus a fine, you can just keep adding it until people obey.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of interventions, but one of them could be just a physical intervention where you take it's beautiful is one of them, but it's also busy. So enforcing busyness, you put an obstacle in the way in which it's easy for inflow in one direction, but if there's a lot of flow at any given time during the day,
yeah, that's
You know what I
tested in emergency
it
models, right?
enforces a physical intervention where people are like, oh, well, I don't really have a choice, provided that it's busy.
Yeah.
And then if it's not busy, why enforce the one-way road?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's just an idea as well. It's-
Yeah.
the-
Yeah, you can test lots of interventions, but you also have to think about the context in which this was actually done. So there was a pandemic and the government has had to make ad hoc decisions, and they cannot really design physical structures for all kind of streets. So the signs were a relatively easy way to do that, and they also had indeed handhaving. But that's very, very costly, of course, to put a person there on the street the whole day. So,
I was just going forward,
Yeah.
just throwing out ideas.
yeah,
And the eyes as well, you see that sometimes as in to prevent, to stop, or to enforce compliance. If people see that there's eyes on a sign, people are more likely to look at it. It's like saliency. People
Yeah.
tune into information, because there's a lot of information around it. If there's eyes, people are more likely to look. Which
or
is
dynamic signs that
flash,
give
yeah.
messages based on what you're doing.
So one follow-up question on this recurring topic of crowdedness, and if a street is blocked by a lot of people.
Yeah.
flow of people. Isn't that automatically taken into account if you actually take into account safety distances to other people? So if you want to keep a 1 meter distance to your, isn't that actually, if that's one of your, part of your rule set, right? Wouldn't then people take those streets less because there's a lot of people?
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't know if people really
Well,
think about that, if they keep 1 meter distance.
I thought that was, I think it was standard, no, isn't, but people are happy with venture together, or
Mhm.
if that's all.
Yeah.
In an elevator that people, of course, tend to distance themselves as much as possible to not get into each other's comfort space.
Yeah, I think there's a theory about it, I think you're kind of a safety space around your body, right, that you actually try to protect all the time. That could be the default theory here.
Yeah. But we can't in this model, because we don't have, as I just answered to him, we don't have the actual distance between the agents.
Yeah, so I had a postdoc who also researched adding social distancing to microsimulators.
Mhm.
And where she used machine learning techniques to find parameters dynamically while simulation was going on.
Oh,
And
yeah.
she also found out that when it is getting more busy, people tend to have a lower social distance.
Yeah.
And that's also what she observed with some footage.
And I think also when it's temporary, the people don't mind so much. If you have to cross someone, you can do that relatively closely.